I'm Jason Pack, and this is Disorder, the podcast that tries to make sense of our mad world, and also our mad evolutionary biology. And today we have part 2 of our discussion with Harvey Whitehouse, author of Inheritance, the Evolutionary Origins of the Modern World. Today's pod is just a continuation of last week's pod. So if you missed part 1, I think you need to go back because you won't know what identity fusion is, in-group conformism, and some of the other concepts we throw out there. And today what we're going to do is my favorite thing. We're going to try to order the disorder. We start off by talking about the evolutionary origins of nationalism and why societies inherently evolve the myths of shared origins of individuals, and these ideas of how we envision ourselves as part of larger groups. It's not just the identity fusion that we talked about with Harvey last week. It's what Peter Turchin calls ultra society. It's that we need these shared myths about in-group solidarity to create large enough collectives to undertake major projects. In other words, large-scale mass-mobilized war would not be possible if we didn't have these mechanisms of feeling mystically fused with people that we didn't meet. And of course, many on the left today, they decry nationalism. Nationalism is bad. Nationalism leads to conflict. But maybe that left-wing critique is missing something. Could nationalism and other forms of intense in-group solidarity actually be a good thing? And that if we didn't have these kind of mechanisms, it would be the dog-eat-dog Hobbesian world of every man for himself, and the collective efforts that I believe are needed to deal with collective problems would be impossible. So, let's kick it off about nationalism and delve back into my conversation with Harvey. I had read Peter Turchin's work, Ultra Society, many years ago, and it's quoted by Harvey Whitehouse in his book, Inheritance. He says, "The reason warfare enlarged the scale of warlike tribes in world history is because, all else being equal, big groups win out in competition with small groups." End quote. These interconnected realizations explain the rise of the nation state and then the particular dominance of the superpowers that we have today. That aggressive anti-foreign nationalism is a part of how we have made national cultures and national armies that can succeed. So this dynamic, Harvey, it's going to be really difficult to overcome because it's been evolutionarily selected for in these superpower national cultures. How are we going to overcome the fact that in our cultural DNA is this preference for really uniting against the outsider?
I think if we're going to address this problem, we're going to need to start by understanding both the evolved psychology and the cultural evolutionary history behind nationalism. And there are 2 pathways to fusion that we know quite a lot about now. One is based on perceptions of shared biology, actually. It's based on the idea that you have some kind of hidden essence in your body that is sometimes construed, well, in modern terms, we think of it as genes, but, in many cultures, it might be your bones or your blood or stuff that's inherited from others, biologically, from your parents. That stuff, thinking about how we're sharing the same biological substance in that way, is a pathway to feeling fused with a group. And that is exploited extensively by all kinds of political groups throughout history, including nationalist ideas about shared ancestry and motherlands and fatherlands and that kind of idea. But there's also the shared experiences pathway to fusion, about which we know quite a bit as well, which is focusing on shared experiences of suffering, in particular on the part of a group. And those shared experiences need to be not any old experiences, but ones that are defining for the members of the group as individuals as well as for the group as a whole. And when that happens, we get this fusion outcome. And that produces very, very strong forms of loyalty and group commitment and willingness, if necessary, to go to war to defend your group. And this has been extensively exploited by political leaders over the course of history, but it's been scaled up through a phenomenon that we call extended fusion, where now we're having whole religious ideologies, for example, that unite people based on narratives of shared suffering, for instance, of a Messiah who's horribly tortured and nailed to a cross. But these ideas of shared suffering are spread and exploited in all kinds of ways by groups of various scales. But the general trend across world history has been to scale up these forms of extended fusion. The trouble is that although warfare has been one of the main drivers, along with agricultural intensity, in creating larger and more complex societies, it can't continue to do so because the lethality of our weaponry now means that it spells potentially disaster, an existential disaster for all of us if we try to use that as a way of continuing to scale up.
The warfare that we need to wage is against climate change or against unbridled AI. So the warfare that I think we're going to need is something that we can all do together against an external enemy. And that's a step change. In other words, we're going to need to evolve a fully different form of human society because the previous ways of doing identity fusion were too adversarial.
I agree with certainly the last part of what you said. We really need to scale up. Actually, I think we need to scale up to the level of global cooperation and global cohesion. But how we do that, do we need a common enemy in order to do it? I argue no, because although that is true of weaker forms of group alignment, like identification, it's not true of fusion. If you think of fusion, the primary group most people are fused with, as I mentioned earlier, is family. But being fused with family does not require enmity towards other families. It does not require any kind of intergroup competition at all to be fused with your family. And I don't believe it requires any kind of intergroup competition or external threat to be fused with humanity at large, frankly. And we have some empirical evidence for this. It's not just me sounding off. We've run a study that was published in Royal Society Open Science earlier this year, showing that if you activate the two pathways to fusion that I've described, the idea of shared biology and the idea of shared experience, but at a scale that unites all human beings everywhere, you really move the dial for people on both fusion with humanity at large and willingness to act, to behave in ways that support global cooperation. To prime feelings of shared experience, we took an experience that is shared by a huge portion of humanity, regardless of country you happen to have been raised in. And that experience was motherhood, right? Many, many women around the world are united by a shared experience of motherhood, but it's a sort of underexploited resource that we have. There are other things that we share as human beings, but which we never really stop and think about just how shared those experiences are, but which could lay the foundations not only for global cohesion, but for global cooperation as well.
So when we're thinking about identity fusion in 2024, it's difficult to avoid thinking about what's happening in the Middle East. You write, when people fuse with a group, their personal group identities become functionally equivalent. If you attack the person, you unleash the rage of the group. And if you attack the group, it is taken personally. When I read this, I realized how profoundly relevant it is for the events of the Middle East. And it is different, and it makes what's happening in Israel-Palestine different than greater, quote unquote, human tragedies in Sudan and Syria and elsewhere. Something about the Holy Land, something about Jews and Palestinians allows people who are not there and have never been there to do identity fusion in ways that obviously hundreds of thousands more people were killed in Syria, but the identity fusion isn't happening. So this is profoundly relevant for me in how diasporic Jews and potentially even evangelical Christians perceived October 7th and the massacres as something that happened to them personally, and how the global left and Muslims and a whole range of post-colonialists have seen the siege in Gaza as happening to them personally. So my takeaway here is that, yeah, there are positives and there are negatives to how this kind of identity fusion can go on and can be played out. And we need to be very careful in how things are covered in the media to not create these tribes, these us and them tribes. What can be done in how the media covers these events where it isn't just going to create globally, we have these different tribes as relate to these issues where you feel the other side has done this to me?
I mean, the reality is that media coverage of horrible events in the world is becoming more and more compelling and immersive. And, we get saturated with images that are so powerful and moving that it can often feel like they're happening to us personally. And this is the foundation for fusion. The possibility that that kind of fusion can turn into violence is very, very considerable, something we should take very seriously. But fusion alone is not a cause of violence. This is important to understand. Fusion is a kind of love. It's a kind of love for the group. But when it's combined with a feeling that the enemy group poses a very significant threat of such magnitude that you really have to respond to it, when it's combined with feelings that the outgroup is something other than or less than human somehow, and when it's combined with a feeling that peaceful solutions are completely impossible, then it leads predictably to violence in so many cases. And I think the danger is that when all four of those things are being stimulated by media reporting at the same time, it's a formula for an increasingly violent world. So how can the media help with this? I think one thing that they can do to start with is to ensure that wherever possible, images of suffering that are of the more kind of visceral, experiential kind, the kind that affect people at a very emotional level, those sorts of forms of reporting, if they're going to be presented in the news, are presented in a way that covers that kind of experience on both sides of a conflict. I think this is absolutely fundamental, actually, because when we recognize how horrible that suffering is on both sides, it opens up the possibility of imagining peaceful outcomes. And we need that step in order to conceive of peace.
That's enough about identity fusion. You also write, quote, "The climate crisis is a global problem, but we don't have a global government. Looking at climate change through my anthropological lens, it strikes me that at the heart of the climate crisis are the ancient biases of conformism, religiosity, and tribalism. The very natural urges that once built civilization now pose its most dangerous threat." That is exactly what the Disorder Pod is about. We are at a place where everything that our human societies have evolved to maximize has put us in a problem where we may extinct ourselves. So what do we need? A new religious system where in this religious system, you're going to get brownie points for not eating beef and for doing less carbon emissions? What do we need?
Well, a lot of people would say what we need is somehow to tamp down or eliminate the fundamental biases that we know are part of human nature. I'm not sure this is terribly realistic because every new generation that is born will just see these things resurfacing. So we've actually got to work with the grain of our biases. We've got to utilize them more effectively. At the moment, the problem is that conformism is using us to engage in forms of overconsumption that are unsustainable. Religiosity is driving us in directions that are, and so is tribalism, driving us in directions that are leading to the deterioration of regional and global cooperation. We've really got to reverse all of this. And we have the potential to do it if we stop to think about how to utilize these features of human nature. Conformism actually is it has a negative connotation, I think, for lots of people. People associate it with slavish copying of other people. But actually, so much of human cooperation would be impossible if we weren't very good at high fidelity copying of one another. The question is, how do we get ourselves copying the right behaviors? I think a lot of the conformism that we need in the world would be conformism that is directed to sustainable lifestyles. And that means embedding the forms of behavior that we want children to learn into the school curriculum and into school life, actually, not just the curriculum.
Yeah, to unpack that answer, a lot of what Harvey's book, Inheritance, explains is how children are so imitative. They don't need to understand why a behavior does a thing. If you rub your belly and then you jump up and down 3 times and spin around and open a box and there's some chocolate in it, they may rub their bellies, jump around, spin around 3 times, open the box, and get the chocolate. So you can make a religious ritual out of everything. And we're inherently superstitious and ritualistic. And I think that that's not negative. And there's been too much over-rationality, maybe on the center left, where we haven't been willing to tap into the ritual aspects of humanity to make people feel good about doing some new rituals that suit our current problems.
I think that's right. I mean, it's even more striking, actually, that even when you tell children not to do the silly and unnecessary things, you gave the example of spinning around and rubbing your tummy, but children will still do that anyway, because it's almost as if they can't help themselves. And part of the reason why children copy these causally unnecessary elements is in order to affiliate, to be part of a group. Children have a very strong desire to sponge up behaviors that are conventional, that are that way because it's the done or the proper way to behave in a particular group. And they're very sensitive to peer pressure in that regard as well.
I think as are adults. In fact, so much of the rally around Trump, the rally around Putin, and then the positive rallies to defend this and that are all about being a part of the group. Everyone knows the election was actually not stolen. But if you say that the election was stolen, you know, your gun-carrying, truck-loving friends and you can go to the monster car rally together and we're all in it together. So that is just the most natural thing on the planet, is to have a catechism. In 3 there was 1, God died and was resurrected, or the election was stolen. It's just the absolutely most natural thing.
I think the key question for me is how we get herded into particular patterns of conformism. Do we want to continue to let ourselves be herded by bad actors or by commercial interests? Or do we want to take control ourselves of the kinds of conventions and norms and behaviors and beliefs and practices that become shared in society and perhaps even globally? And I think the latter, right? I really think that we need to think more intelligently about how to accomplish that in ways that are consensual and in the interests of all. And how do you do that?
Well, during the Ordering the Disorder segment, we're going to do exactly that. But before then, we can't have any podcast without some agreeable disagreement. I realize we've been too much on the same page, both in the first episode and now in our second episode about intergroup fusion. So I want to push you on something that we might slightly disagree on. You write, when we consider the material lives of humans over the millennia, the pursuit of economic growth as an end in itself only features at the very end of that history. We are not really natural capitalists, we are foragers. Humans everywhere will happily become engrossed in picking berries from bushes, a propensity that is nowadays callously exploited by the gambling industry, using slot machines with images of fruit that need to be matched up to obtain a reward. So I don't buy that. I don't buy that we're foragers, and I don't buy that whether it's gambling companies or the need to shoot and catch and this and that, the other is playing on our kind of innate biology. I think that those are just little quirks. What we are is OCD. People are just OCD. It's not that we're foragers and that when we're playing some gambling game, the rewards look like cherries. Just people get OCD and you can addict them to a gambling app. No?
Yeah, I mean, I'm pretty sympathetic to you. I admit that the passage that you just read out is one of the... I tried to limit the number of speculative passages I included in the book, and this is admittedly one of those. But I think the basic idea, I think, is potentially defensible. I think there is some good research about our sort of foraging mindset, but let's not get into that. Let's say that OCD is one of those things that drives us to, for instance, keep wanting to sort of pull the arm on a slot machine, right? So maybe that's partly driven by OCD. But what we do in my field where we look at phenomena like this is we try to break it up. We call it fractionating the phenomenon. That usually something like placing money into a slot machine is not the product of one evolved mechanism, but typically multiple mechanisms can come into play. And one of those could well be something rather like OCD, right? Because most of us don't suffer from OCD, but all of us have some of the components that lead to OCD built into our brain systems. And this means that we all have a natural propensity to want to, arrange objects in a way that is symmetrical, or that we want to arrange them in ways that, keep certain things separated and apart from other things. And we're concerned about threshold and entrance and various kinds of things like that become exaggerated in rather tragic ways in OCD patients, but which we all can kind of recognize. In fact, if you look at the range of cultural rituals around the world, they all have characteristics that are very similar to the list of OCD symptoms. So they're part of the normal range of human thinking and behavior.
Now, something that we can agree on agreeably and slightly disagree on is the question of, are humans utility maximizers? I think that the huge problem in diplomacy is the idea that the realists invented, which is that states try to maximize their interests. And the huge flaw in classical economics is the idea that individuals and corporations try to maximize their utility, which we are now correcting with behavioral economics. The fact is we're not utility maximizers, and that the distinction between, well, some people are formalists and others are trying to utility maximize, no one really utility maximizes. If you get in the head of a CEO like Elon Musk, he wants Twitter because it's a status project. He's not trying to get the next billion. He has enough billions. Trump, when he gets into office, he doesn't need to increase U.S. strategic power vis-a-vis having a new trade agreement with Belgium. He's not utility maximizing. So this is critical. What does your research show us about how we're not utility maximizing? Why do these dumb economists and realist poli-sci professors think that we're constantly utility maximizing?
It's a very interesting question, isn't it? I've puzzled for a long time over the question, why do certain ideologies surrounding capitalism and ideas about the free market get so widely disseminated that they become almost seen as natural and inevitable? I think Karl Marx actually famously wrote, I think it was in volume 1 of Capital, that I think he had a passage on what he called the fetishism of commodities, where he talked about this idea that money can be used to make money, that money is somehow pregnant and gives birth to money. These kinds of ideas often are uninspected until somebody like Marx or somebody else who's sort of looking at things from a different angle says, hang on a minute, what the hell are we talking about here? This is ridiculous.
That's right. This gets to the same realization, which we've talked about previously on the pod, which is that neoliberalism is like a religion. It can't be proved. The idea that you need to have markets everywhere and you need to privatize everything, it's as religious an idea as the fact that communism is a religious idea, that we need to have the state control and monopolize all property. What I find fascinating by inserting your evolutionary biology lens is that we've gone off on some deep end in the social sciences over the last, call it 100 years, thinking that humans are these rational utility maximizing beings, and that through better and better forms of markets or better and better forms of states competing for interests, we can do utility maximization. It doesn't make sense because we're not utility maximizers. So we can't order the disorder until we kind of throw away these old and bogus ideas.
I think that's right. I mean, it first dawned on me that we had to rethink this when I was living for 2 years deep in the rainforest in Papua New Guinea with a group who had very little money and had no real need for money because they made, their living from the things they grew in their gardens and hunted in the forest. But they had little, small amounts of money, and I found it really fascinating that from their perspective, the way that they raised these small amounts of money was by raising cash crops that were of no obvious value whatsoever, things like cocoa and coffee. Nobody ate chocolate and nobody drank coffee and had no idea what was happening with this stuff that they knew they could grow and then sell to middlemen and get some money for. And I felt when I realized just how meaningless money was, that it was very strange that we place it at the heart and center of so much of our thinking. And what really strikes me as more fundamentally true of our needs as human beings, and I think this is as true of us as it is of the people I lived with in Papua New Guinea, is that there are two ways in which material objects are kind of a good thing for us as humans. One obvious way is that they provide, for our basic needs. We need food, we need shelter, we need those kinds of things that contribute to meeting those needs. But we also have an orientation towards things as symbolic objects that sort of hold histories, that represent relationships, and that are important to us in building cooperation. And throughout Melanesia, the region that I was living in there in Papua New Guinea, the distinction between the two is often very sharp, that you'll have very elaborate exchanges of valuable objects that have very symbolic properties as a sphere of exchange that's quite distinct from the everyday stuff of just meeting your sort of subsistence needs. And I think this is true in a lot of societies. We can even see it in complex capitalist societies that we live in, that there's a sort of realm in which there are objects that really matter because they represent relationships, the gifts that we give each other, or represent histories, the amazing sort of beautiful artworks that we like to collect and display and that kind of thing, versus the crappy stuff that is being sold to us online and on the high street shops, much of which we don't actually need, and yet we seem driven to sort of consume it in excess.
After the break, how does understanding why we do the things we do and our shared biology present some opportunities for us to order the disorder? Mega orderers, wanted to tell you guys about another podcast that I really like, The Jordan Harbinger Show. We're really fortunate to have Jordan as a guest later this year. He is a superstar. His show features in-depth interviews with some of the world's most fascinating minds. And what Jordan brings to the pod is a cool, calm Californian energy, talking about tech regulation, but then also relationships and some self-help advice. He also speaks with some of the most fascinating minds out there, like Jamie Metzel and Bill Browder. It's really a must-listen for any of you mega orderers out there. Search for The Jordan Harbinger Show on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. We're back with Harvey Whitehouse, who's written Inheritance: The Evolutionary Origins of the Modern World. And he writes in his epilogue, "This book has focused on three dimensions of human nature, seen from three distinct perspectives: the biological evolution of our psychology over millions of years, the cultural evolution of our political and economic systems over thousands of years, and the problems we are now facing as a result. My central argument," meaning his central argument, "has been that although our ability to harness and manage the three biases allows us to scale up cooperation in the past, our inherited methods of cooperation are now herding us down a pathway to destruction." And this is what the Disorder Program is about. We are headed towards this disorder. We are in the enduring disorder already. But, and I'm continuing the quote, "By understanding better how cultural evolution allowed us to overcome the limitations of human nature in the past, we can use that knowledge to make game-changing decisions about our collective futures." Let's do it. Let's change the game. Tell the mega orderers how we can do this.
Well, the first thing we need to do is to get better leaders. We need leaders who don't just represent some kind of local group, some barrier-bound group whose interests are all important to them and the interests of other groups are not. That's not the kind of leadership we need. We need leaders who can see how we can achieve a better situation for all of us. And in many cases, that means a better situation also for the in-group. But that also means leaders who are willing to persuade people to get on board with ideas that they're not in the habit of taking seriously. So we need persuaders, we need charismatic individuals, and we need powerful ideologies as well. So how do we achieve those things in ways that don't end up exploiting us? I think the answer to that lies partly in citizens' assemblies. I think these are an incredibly powerful way of enabling democracy to be done in an intelligent and thought through fashion, in a way that doesn't get hijacked by the media and turned into sound bites that then can be exploited in ways that sell us products but actually don't get us to better policies. I think the great thing about citizens' assemblies is that it's a cross-section of the population. It's a large enough number of people and a diverse enough group of people that you can really get a range of opinions. And it's a situation in which expert advice is provided so that people can make intelligent and thought through decisions through discussion.
Yeah, we've had Brian Klass, our shared friend, on the pod a few times, and he's all into citizen assemblies and sortition because it creates group buy-in. It does what the Athenian polis did of getting rid of special interest groups by having people just decide. My fear is that what we really need is expert technocracy. But you're right, we're in a very anti-expert moment and people are not convinced by experts. So how do we use these citizen assemblies to get people to buy into trusting expert advice?
Well, here's a really radical idea, and we may end up disagreeing about it, and I'm not wedded to it, but I really think it's worth seriously considering, which is to make the work of formulating policy the job primarily of citizens' assemblies or organizations similar to that, and to take that job away from politicians. Instead, make politicians expert technocrats capable of implementing policy that is devised through very carefully thought through processes of expert informed democratic discussion. Make politicians worthy of their positions of leadership by respecting and trusting them to implement successfully, but make their implementation work transparent so that we can watch it closely and observe and applaud when it's done well. And so much policy is devised by politicians on the hoof without proper understanding of the issues that they're deciding in a desperate and vain attempt to secure popular support or to ensure support from various factions within their parties. This is a terrible way to design policy. And of course, it contributes to the disorder that we're all experiencing.
Yeah, so leadership and transparency are two of the things that we come back to in the Ordering the Disorder. Alex Hall talks about them all the time. And I think we need radical transparency because it's the only way to undercut the conspiracy theories that our modern media landscape generates. So yeah, radical transparency. But how are we going to get there? Do you know what I mean? The kind of leadership that you're talking about, what are we going to go clone Churchill and FDR? I mean, how are we going to get to this leadership that you speak of?
Well, I think Brian Klass makes the point wonderfully in his work that it's not just about trying to find the right personality profiles of leaders. It's also about creating the institutional frameworks that provide the right incentives for leaders and the right opportunities to engage in long-term thinking and to take public service as the core central feature of what they do rather than staying in power or fighting off rivals.
And not only that, we probably need to pay our civil servants more, we need to pay our MPs more, and we need to give them higher social status. One of the problems that we've seen is that the social status of public servants and politicians has cratered. Whereas in societies like Japan or South Korea, where being a teacher or a public servant is still a very high status profession, or in Singapore, where it's an extremely high status profession, what do you know? Better people do it, and there's more social cohesion. So I think there are some no-brainers there on how to order the disorder. But I want to go back to the evolutionary biological stuff that you've pointed out about conformism and ritualism. How can we harness this religious feeling to order the disorder, rather than just the leadership and transparency that people who don't have your depth of engagement with the biology and the anthropology, they can come up with that stuff. I want to hear from you about things that we can do that draw on your work and what you've come to understand about human nature.
I think there are several things that we can do. One of the most important things we can do is to recognize that religion is here to stay. The vast majority of people in the world align themselves with some kind of organized religion. All the world religions and their myriad offshoots provide scriptural support for stewardship of the planet, for taking care of God's creation. This is a really important feature of the vast majority of religions in the world that is grotesquely underexploited, in the sense that we could be utilizing the social glue that religions produce in ways that allow us to act collectively on a huge scale to protect ourselves against the ravages of the climate crisis and biodiversity loss and other challenges facing us right now. Religions could be a powerful force, a tool, a lever in all of this, and we're just not using them in that way.
I couldn't agree more. So let's end with this moment of optimistic future agreement. I feel like you're a mega orderer. And so for all the listeners out there, wow, you're going to love Inheritance, the evolutionary origins of the modern world. Why do I think you're going to love it? Because you get a sense of how it's in our genes and in our cultural connections, the potential for order, as well as the causes of the disorder that we experience. I mean, I felt like I was just reading the podcast. So it's been a great treat to have you on.
Thank you so much for having me.
As always, you can find out more about today's show by following the links in the show notes. And we're going to have some more of Harvey's research, links about the book and his biography. And if you're interested in this topic, please subscribe to our Substack, where we're going to be delving deeper into some of Peter Turchin's work and Brian Klaas and things that we heard from Jamie Metzel and how it connects to what Harvey has said today. So, mega orderers out there, you know we need to end every episode by thanking the mega orderer in chief, the one, the only, the George McDonagh, our producer, and our executive producer, Neil Fearn. We hope you have a week which is so orderly, it comes from your evolutionary tendencies to love order. See you next week.